Boom. Welcome to another episode of Apocalypse here. We are doing another episode on the book, and we decided to do this one not live because we're trying to make these videos really good for people that maybe aren't as familiar with our channel and are interested in the book specifically, so we can kind of keep it, straight to the point and just kind of cut out any tangents or anything we don't really want to include just in these. So a little different than our regular podcast episodes. But yeah, we're thankful everybody who is here watching. And we haven't been live or done a video in a little while, but just kind of life stuff happened and whatever schedules are tough. But we're definitely still going to be here. We'll be coming back with more regular podcast episodes for sure. This episode is chapter 4 of the book.
We're getting into kind of after the positive account that we gave. So we gave this sort of like, this is what we think Paul's Evangelion is good news, his gospel, actually is. And it's a gospel of a loving God who reaches out to save us in accordance with his initial purposes to gather all of the cosmos into fellowship with God's self. So we laid that out up front, giving you the good stuff. And now we're kind of shifting over into what we consider to be a kind of problematic reading of Paul, a problematic account of his gospel, or his a problematic theory of salvation, really, is what we're after here. So we really need to know what this is right away before we actually go into solving, how do we actually address this issue? We really need to know what it is, as we say in the book, like the back of our hand, right? We really need to get this stuff kind of in our brains, and then we can kind of move on to a proposed solution later on.
Yeah, so that was kind of my first question I was going to ask, but you kind of answered, just like kind of recapping the first 2 chapters.
Yeah, I can give a little more there too.
Yeah, so maybe, more specifically, like, what is, like you said, the kind of the first 2 chapters were the positive accounts. So, like, in a very short, like, specific way, like, kind of lay out what is the gospel as you guys are putting forward and what you think is a much more accurate account of the gospel.
So the account that we give is principally coming from Romans chapters 5 through 8, although it is obviously going to show up in many other places as we show. But what it's really about is it begins with Jesus Christ. It begins with the revelation of who God really is in Jesus Christ and by the Spirit, by the mediating power of the Spirit. So this is kind of the starting point for Paul's gospel, his good news. And what we learn about this good news is that it's really all about a God who is resurrected all of humanity, all the cosmos in Jesus Christ. So it's a resurrectional gospel. And it's really a Jewish story because Paul's a Jew. It's an emphasis on resurrection. But Paul kind of gives a twist on this, that it's principally Christ's resurrection that then affects our resurrection because we're linked up to him through the Spirit. And what happens in our kind of being linked up and joined, often Paul will talk about this as being in Christ. This shows up over 160 times, either being in Christ or some equivalent, over 160 times in his texts, which is a lot. Because we're linked up in Christ, it's not just a single person being resurrected. We're resurrected in him. And in him, we're transformed, we're renewed, we're healed, we're delivered from this problem that has been taking humanity captive. So we talk about that in terms of sin, death, the flesh, and powers. So all that stuff has been left behind in Christ's death and resurrection, and it affects us because we're in him. We participate in him. So a key word here is going to be participation in Christ. So it's a participational and resurrectional gospel. It's taking the kind of whole sweep of Christ's life, death, resurrection into account, and we're closely in that. We're right in Christ, and that's how we get changed and are made new. And this is both a present reality, because this helps us make sense of how Paul deals with very contingent and particular circumstances. And it's also a future thing. We're not fully resurrected, right? We don't have the new spiritual body. We're still kind of waiting for that. But we live out of this resurrected reality in Christ, not least because we have his mind, as Paul tells us. We have the mind of Christ. We have a new mind that allows us to act in ways that are pleasing to God and that are life-giving and peacemaking, and all of that. So that's kind of the heart of what we see as Paul's gospel. And the cool thing is that this account of the gospel makes sense of what we have identified as about 90%, if not a little bit more, of Paul's actual material. Obviously, in Christ shows up a lot, but even when it's not explicitly mentioned, like Paul doesn't just say in Christ, you can still see how he's speaking out of this new resurrected reality in Christ to offer advice to his communities to say, hey, this is how you're supposed to live out this stuff, right? So we think this account of the gospel makes sense of the vast majority of what Paul's texts actually say to us. So that's kind of a quick summary of what we think Paul's gospel is all about.
This makes sense of like the contingent aspects, like the way Paul, like you lay out specifically, you say basically the way we're not reading a systematic theology from Paul at all. Like he doesn't do that anywhere, really. So, but what he does do is give advice, and he uses his understanding of theology to inform the way he like it gives advice or addresses certain concerns or things along those lines. So yeah, so I think a lot of people will want to like let that contingent stuff kind of be what it is and really prioritize the at least anything that at least gets closer to a more systematic theological, like specifically theological words or phrases that Paul wants to use. But if you really think about it, like if Paul really believes this stuff, which clearly he does, then it would hopefully inform the way he addresses all these situations. So that's why I really appreciate what you said. That's like what you guys are trying to do. Not only worry about the specifically theological phrases and whatnot that he uses, but how does our understanding of the gospel make sense of how he addresses the problems? And I think you guys do a great job of that.
Yeah,
but yes, I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I think we need to sort out what Paul is actually telling us in terms of his gospel. So his coherence, I think, always already in relation to contingency. So you and I did an episode a long time ago. I think it might have been on your channel on J.C. Becker, or it might have been on mine. I'm not.
I think it was on yours. Sure. You did, yeah.
On coherence and contingency. We're just kind of cashing that out, right? Once you like, we have to be thinking about these things together, right? If an account of Paul's gospel can't make sense of the contingent stuff, how Paul is actually preaching and teaching and living alongside people, it's not going to be an accurate account of Paul's gospel. If it can do that, then we know we're kind of in the right direction, right? So that's what we're after here. Even though we don't get into the sort of missional kind of stuff, really, it's always already kind of in our minds. And Doug's little book, Paul and Apostles' Journey, cashes that out really neatly. So,
which a great thing just to note about that book is there is an audiobook version of that one on.
Yeah, I've actually been trying to figure out the audiobook for this too, because I might do it.
Okay.
It just depends on. I'm not sure how picky they are about like audio equipment and that sort of stuff, and like.
Yeah. So the next point you make, which is a really big one, and we definitely want to touch on, is the whole idea that. So now you're like after what we just said, now you're really getting into the meat of like what justification theory is, and before you get specifically in the details of it, you kind of have this whole section about how justification is sort of a presupposition or a pre-understanding.
It's common to think that like we can just pick up a text and just kind of lift out of it what it's actually saying. We kind of know better now in terms of like linguistic studies and also philosophical studies of language that this is just not how humans work in terms of processing data. So we're leaning on important scholar Gadamer, who I don't know if many people are familiar with him or his work, but his understanding of sort of how we all come to text with pre-understandings that are actually helping us interpret the data. So reading is just sort of an especially kind of specialized account of data interpretation. But we all have to come to a text with stuff that we're bringing to it. I'm never going to deny that. Like, I don't think pre-understandings are bad. I think it just matters which ones we're actually bringing to the table and how much kind of work they're doing and how conscious we are of those things. It's like putting on glasses, right? If you're not aware of what they're doing, you're not going to really understand how those glasses are doing work in terms of bringing in sensory data, right, you can take them for granted, right? And I think a lot of people do that with the biblical text, not just the biblical text, but just really any sort of data interpretation, right? So our kind of understanding of what justification theory, and people have kind of griped about this, especially in relation to Douglas's like big book on it, Deliverance of God, that like, why use this language of justification theory? Well, it's really because it's a pre-understanding, right? So justification theory is a particular way of combining really our kind of received expectations of what certain words, so here just words, works, law, faith, the combination of those things in a certain way that we may not even be aware of. You can see that this isn't just being lifted out of the text. This is also something that we're bringing to it. So we have certain expectations that we're bringing in terms of what Paul must mean by just, the righteousness of God, what he means by faith, what he means by works of law, all those sorts of things. And you can see how this theory is combining all of these things in a certain way when it's reading not the 90% of the material that we were talking about, but this other 10% of what Paul writes. So it's reading this 10% in a particular way. So we need to figure out how is it actually doing that, right? So we call it a theory. I mean, we can call it whatever we want. I mean, Doug's called it many different things. The old perspective, you know, a bit unfairly, the Lutheran reading, right? He's kind of walked that back. And I think I've been, you know, not to toot my own horn, I've been someone who's kind of pushing him not to use Lutheran because it's really not that helpful or fair to Luther or Lutherans in general. But that I think talking about it in terms of a theory of salvation, so justification theory, indicates that it's a particular way of reading these justification texts that show up in about 10% of what Paul wrote. So that's really what we mean by that. It's stuff we're bringing to it. It's certain expectations we're bringing to the text, and it's doing a lot of work. And we can isolate this model and show how the mechanics of it work, right?
Yeah, and as far as a pre-understanding goes, it's kind of like you don't lay this, like this isn't really something you talk about in the book. You're going to have to come with some sort of pre-understanding in order to read the words on the page, essentially, or whatever. But with the Bible specifically, and especially like with Paul, I mean, the fact that when Paul was writing this, he didn't have a particular order of books in mind, or he didn't think he was writing the Bible in any sort of sense of the word.
Mail.
Yeah,
he's sending letters,
which is not something many people are gonna disagree with, obviously, because it's. But with that said, the order you read them in is gonna inform some. You know, like even if you want to say all I'm doing is reading the text and not trying to bring anything to it, well, you're gonna get a sort of vibe, or sort of like tone in a certain sense. Like if you read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians first or whatever, you're gonna get you're gonna have this certain like attitude going into the other one. So there's no way. I mean, it's one thing if you're reading a book like what you guys wrote here, like clearly you're laying out a specific argument, so like you're not going to say that like the first chapter informing the second chapter is sort of a pre-understanding you shouldn't have, or whatever, because that's what you're intending to do. But with the Bible, like, I mean, it really can depend on the order you read it and like how there's so much that goes into it, because it's not sort of a systematic, philosophical book or anything like that. Like you said, it's just mail. So so really, like if people want to deny that they're coming with a pre-understanding specifically with the Bible, I think it's like even extra impossible.
For sure. And like we've tried to be pretty transparent about ours. We actually really do believe that God revealed God's self definitively in Jesus Christ. This is a God of love who wants to draw all people and all things into fellowship with God through the Spirit. That's the stuff that's the key stuff that we're bringing into our interpretation of what Paul's doing. And what happens there when you do that is it allows you to actually see, and this is why I think it's actually a good pre-understanding to bring to the text, is you actually see this great conundrum in Pauline studies between this massive amount of data that seems to be saying just that sort of stuff, or at least depending on that for Paul to address certain circumstances. And then you have this minority set. You can see that clearly too. in the light of these commitments as well. So that's a good reason why to buy into this other kind of way of coming at the text too.
And
it's a better way in.
Yeah, and just acknowledging that, like, the whole printer saying thing, it just allows you to compare the different
absolutely.
readings. Like, it is what it is. Like, you got to compare this understanding with this understanding. It's not just an argument about which one directly comes out of the text, because nothing does.
Right, and which one can sort of handle the actual data better. Like,
Mm-hmm.
coming down to specific words and phrases too, which we do later on in the book. We're going to talk about justification words. We're going to talk about faith, what faith is doing. We're going to talk about works of law, what that's doing. All these sorts of things. It's going to, I mean, not to give too much away. I think it gives you a better sense of how to actually read these accurately, because you're not so closed off with this other theory that kind of constricts you to just certain ways of understanding what the certain data points mean. So
perfect. So just kind of move on, like, with that. Now we get into the, like, actual the chapter or the heading or the mechanics of justification theory. So really, like, the meat and bones of what's going on. And you guys chose to kind of look at John Piper for a specific, understanding of what justification theory is. So I don't know, maybe I think it'd be cool for this, like, what made you choose John Piper to kind of go through this? And I'm just curious, as far as, like, insider information, like, were there any other people you guys considered like this, or was John Piper kind of a really good example? And it kind of,
he's kind of the clearest on this in writing, because really the key premises show up almost like verbatim in the way that, like, Doug described them in Deliverance when he was laying out the theory in Deliverance of God. And it was Piper published it like just before kind of Doug's book was published, and he was like, oh shoot, is this gonna really just completely debunk my book? And it turns out it's just premise after premise after premise, clear as day all the way through. Because of that, and because Piper's a really clear writer and also a really influential kind of pastor and public figure, really, we thought it was good to do that, to go with him as kind of showing how this theory kind of makes its way through his kind of understanding of justification in Paul. As far as other figures, we had thought about Simon Gathercole, who wrote a book on substitutionary atonement. He was trying to kind of show how you can have substitution without penal substitution. And what happens in the book, as you might expect, is that the punitive aspect ends up coming back in, despite his best efforts. He's a really clear and clever guy. So he thought about him using his book, but Piper just lays it out so systematically that it's like, why not use this? And then at the end, showing how, hey, this isn't just John Piper. This isn't just some people who follow John Piper. This shows up everywhere. This shows up in so many commentaries, so many introductions to New Testament that talk about Paul, so many articles, so many faith statements, so many ecumenical statements having to do with the gospel, right? And so many sort of evangelical and evangelistic, like, tracts and pamphlets and all that. It's just everywhere. This is just in the water. So we didn't want to just leave it at we're trying to, nail Piper or something. We want to show that this is actually all over the place.
Yeah, but it's good to, I think the way you did it is really good, to go with a specific person, so you can't say, somebody can't just say, oh, well, you're saying this from this guy and this from this guy or whatever. It's not exactly what people believe, but so to go with a specific person and then to show how it's not only him, though, is, I think the best kind of way to go about this. So in the book, you guys go through, I think it's about 9 points or so that get super specific, but that's what the book's for. People can read that there. So instead of going through each one specifically, if you could just kind of lay out, what is justification theory? Like, what exactly are you addressing, sort of summarized in for this video? And like I said, the book has a lot more details with all these points, but
So the way that this account of salvation, or this theory of salvation, works is it begins with the individual in its state of nature. And in this sense, it's actually going to be quite Jewish. The Jew is going to be sort of the quintessential individual here, because Paul talks about Jews in this kind of situation. We will end up talking about this. This may be helpful to actually introduce now in terms of box A. So this is the initial state kind of that we're in. All people are in this box A. So we have the individual there. What the individual learns there is that there's self-evident knowledge of God. Everyone knows what God is like, the nature of God, right in that state of nature. This is what some theologians would talk about in terms of natural theology or general revelation, right? Everyone has accurate, enduring access to what God is really like right up front. This is where we're at right away. What we learn about God is that God is really irritated with humanity, because all of humanity knowingly, because they know God, they know God's expectations, they know what God's will for them is. Everyone knowingly disobeys God right up front. So God's really irritated. And God's response to this, because people are without excuse at this point, is to respond with wrath. And it's a particular kind of wrath. It's retribution. It's a payment to them for something they've done wrong. So humans sin because they know God, they know God's expectations, and then God responds to that with the appropriate, according to the system, payment, which is, we learn, punishment. It's retribution for what humans have done. Okay, so this is all happening kind of in the opening phase. People are either doing the right thing or really the wrong thing, and what we learn based on how God responds to wrongdoing is that right doing is going to lead to a reward, right? So wrongdoing leads to punishment, right doing to a reward. So this is kind of where we're getting toward the end of box A, right? Now what happens is that humans are all failing at this. They just don't do it. They're not obeying God. They universally fail. They're in this sort of situation of introspection and guilt and all of that sort of stuff because they can't do it. They can't do God's expectations, unfortunately. Precisely coming out of Romans 1, because they keep just kind of suppressing it. They keep pushing it down. And because of that, all of humanity, because no one can do the right thing, deserves retribution, right? So we've set up this kind of like desert-based situation where people who, possibly could do the right thing get rewarded, but it turns out they just can't. Everyone does the wrong thing. So everyone deserves punishment, all of humanity, because of their sins and transgressions. So that's box A. It's a pretty negative account of the good news right away, which should probably tell you something, because the vast majority of what we've been talking about so far is pretty negative, right? There is a solution here, though. We finally get to kind of the good news, the good part of the good news, because it has been pretty dismal up to this point, is that Christ enters in and satisfies this punishment that we deserve on the cross, specifically on the cross, in his death on the cross. So it's very focused on Good Friday. Christ gets punished for what we deserve. And I'm sure lots of people know that this kind of point in this gospel is often referred to as penal substitution, right? Christ gets what we deserve. So that's the initial part of the solution, is that Christ satisfies God's anger and wrath and retribution that should be aimed toward us. But that doesn't really do us much good either, if Christ is just getting something and we don't get like anything positive. So what happens is what's known as the doctrine of imputation. So we get imputed with Christ's righteousness. And what that means is that God now views us as if we're Christ. Nothing really changes in us. We're clothed with Christ, right? God now views us as righteous. Now, how do we access this? Because it's not just going to happen for us. Well, we have to have faith alone, right? The important part of justification is by faith alone. So to get Christ's righteousness and to be clothed and viewed as righteous, to be viewed as righteous is to appropriate this by assenting to faith in Christ. Okay. So that's how we actually get involved in this stuff, is through faith. So that's really just kind of a summary of how this works.
I think the one thing you point out, which is really important, and just something as I was reading, is like the whole idea that like we're credited, nothing inherently changes
No, you're just
in
counted
us,
as
but
righteous.
it's just counted. So it's almost strange because it's like Christ didn't just like God didn't look at Christ and be like, you look like you're dead. Like he actually
No, I
had to
actually killed
die.
him. Yeah.
Yeah, but all we get is like you're a, I'll look at you like you're
Yeah, you're
righteous.
viewed as righteous.
Yeah, it's kind of
Right.
strange the way it's not really the same on both sides.
Yeah, and there's a debate over this too within kind of justification theorist camps about like what exactly imputation is doing, right? There's a bit of a disagreement, but that's essentially what's going on here.
We go on to talk a little bit about the whole faith alone thing, and I don't know if we want to get into that here. Maybe you can, maybe you just kind of
Yeah, I
give
can
summary
touch
of
on
like,
that for sure. Because
yeah,
remember
a little
the
bit.
initial phase, we're expected to do certain things that apparently we just can't do, right? So that's impossible, essentially. So we're kind of screwed. But what happens in box B, the second part of this, the kind of the good news of this part, is that there's an easier situation that we can kind of actually become a part of, and that's having faith. That's an easier kind of, as we'll talk about later on in the book, it's an easier kind of criteria or contract to be involved in than doing all of this stuff that we're expected to do. So it's an easier way out. It gets you out of this situation. And it's through faith alone, because we don't want to be doing things on this model to actually get saved. Even though that was kind of the initial phase, is that we were supposed to actually be able to do that, but we didn't. And so God in Christ offers us this easier kind of contract and criteria to be saved. So that's how that kind of works.
Yeah.
With faith.
But I think it's important you point out that's still another contract and still another, condition we have to meet in order to.
Yes, right. Yeah. So this is how justification theory explains this 10% of justification material. This is what it does with it. And like we said earlier on, like this is pretty well documented in many, many, many sources that we have in footnotes. So it's not just John Piper. It shows up all over the place. It's the dominant kind of reading of Paul's gospel, or a theory of Paul's gospel. Yeah.
You point out, I think I see John or Bart Ehrman in one of these footnotes even kind of understands it this way, which is pretty interesting. Yeah, I just think that pointed out like in his introduction to the New Testament.
That's his reading of Paul. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. It's not just evangelicals that are reading it this way, but and it's so you bring up justification, they think, oh, Paul, you know what I mean? Like it's just like those two things go together when it's like you guys pointed out, which kind of close it out here, and it's just important to note that that's a very small amount of what Paul is actually talking about.
Yep. So going forward, now that we know what justification theory is, what we're going to do in the next couple of chapters is really talk about like, okay, we have this 10% of data. We have this 90%. We have this theory that's reading this 10% in this particular way. How do we coordinate these two data sets? And we're going to show kind of the kind of old school reformed way of doing this, which is going to be kind of sequencing these into justification, sanctification. So the 10% being justification, the 90% material being sanctification. So they just kind of smash them together, right? Hope it works. Philip Melanchthon is kind of the key person who runs this justification to sanctification sequence, and we show how that just does not work. There are deep contradictions between these two sets of data, so you can't just smash them together and expect it to work. So that initial kind of way of trying to solve this, just it doesn't give us anything that's useful constructively for Paul. So that's a little teaser for next time. But that's the great conundrum that we talk about, is how do we coordinate these sets of data? successfully in a way that reads Paul as a coherent thinker, because he's smarter than I think we think he is. We don't have to assume right off the bat that he's just going to be incoherent. How do we actually do that with these sets of material? And I think we can do it. But we have to go through how other scholars have tried to solve this.
Yeah, so if you enjoyed this, definitely liking the video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment are great, easy ways to support us. And we have the Patreon, patreon.com/apocalypse here. But specifically with these videos too, like be on the lookout for the book when it comes out. I know John posted some of the cover art stuff a little while back. We talked about that in one of our last podcasts, so that was really cool. And it's cool to see kind of everything coming together. So soon enough, we'll have a date specifically for when this is coming out. But yeah, be on the lookout. And when it does come out, pick up the book, because that will be awesome to see more people kind of reading it and really engaging with specifically what you guys are doing. But yeah, I'm super excited for that. And I think this was a really good episode. So with that, this has been Apocalypse here.
Christianity you can live with.